so we're going to get started. A few folks are still popping in, but we'll just get through the intros and housekeeping as folks are joining. So I'm Rebecca Troutfetter. Welcome to Cost Effectiveness 101 training. Before we jump in, a couple of house cleaning items to share. First off, hopefully you wouldn't have any issues connecting through the audio on your computer. But if you are, we do have option B here where you can select phone call. And it'll show you the dial-in and access code and audio pin that you can use to connect from a phone or a cell phone. The other thing is we do have some time built in today for Q&A at the end for some live Q&A. But you'll also notice in the control panel, you do have a way to submit questions as we're going along. So if you have a burning question that you don't want to forget, feel free to type it into the question box there. And Katie and I will address it when we get to the Q&A section. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump in and get started first by going over the agenda for today. So we'll kick off with a safety moment. Then myself and Katie will introduce ourselves so you know who's going to be talking to you for the next hour or so. We'll also let you know what you've exactly signed up for and go over some of our learning objectives. And then we're going to dive right into the content and talk about what is the purpose of cost effectiveness tests, what are the 5 most common ones that we see and we use, and hopefully kind of build a strong foundation around those basics. And then we'll wrap up with some working examples of trying to take everything we've discussed in the first 2 sections and work through, hey, what would it look like in a real life example to offer, for this offering, what are the inputs? What if we change some of those inputs? What happens? And then we'll wrap up and have some Q&A. So starting with safety moment, we thought it was appropriate for today, since we are going to be sitting for the next hour or so, to talk about the risks of sitting too much. So I think a lot of us are aware that a lot of research has linked sitting for too long of periods to a lot of different health issues, things like increased blood sugar levels, cholesterol levels being impacted, maybe things like cardiovascular diseases can be associated to sitting for extended periods of time. So if you are sitting for a long time, whether it's at your desk, whether it's behind the wheel of a vehicle, in front of some form of a screen, we do know it can be harmful, and we wanted to share a couple tips today on how you might have some interventions for that. So the first thing is, if you are sitting, I sit all day for my day job, try to take a break from sitting every 30 minutes. We're going to be in this session for the next hour. Only Katie and I are on video, so we will not see you if you're getting up to stretch or walk around your workspace to keep your blood flowing. Other tips include, stand maybe while you're talking on the phone or watching television. If you have access to a standing desk, that's a great way to introduce some movement into your day-to-day by sitting or standing. I love to do this when I have the opportunity to be in person with my team members, to go for take a meeting as a walk, or a one-on-one as a walk out to a bench near the office. And then for those who are super brave, you might consider a treadmill working station if you have access to one. And there's many other tips you can find online and also through our source here for the Mayo Clinic. So keep moving, keep your blood flowing today and always. So Katie and I are going to introduce ourselves. First, as mentioned, I'm Rebecca Troutfetter. I'm the Vice President of Engineering and Corporate Impact here at CLEAResult. I've worked in energy efficiency space for about 20 years, and I've had great opportunities to work in all aspects of the industry. So I've worked in implementation, program design, policy, evaluation, and I've done a ton of cost effectiveness analysis in my career so far. So I'm really excited to be on the call today and kick off this 101 training and hopefully be a resource to you all in some way now or in the future as you're jumping in and tackling the different cost effectiveness puzzles you have to solve. Katie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca, and thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Katie Brewer, and I'm the Regulatory Policy Design and Business Growth Analyst here at CLEAResult. My professional background is primarily in the public sector and state government, both in a regulatory and legislative capacity. Currently, in my role, I'm touching cost effectiveness on a very regular basis, whether it be through portfolio design, evaluation defense, kind of commission monitoring and regulatory activities. And then one thing also that we're tracking pretty closely in coordination with the National Association of State Energy Offices is 2 pieces of federal legislation I think we're all very familiar with at this point, IIJA and IRA, and what kind of impacts those are going to have on our utility programs and our cost effectiveness moving forward. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Rebecca for our introduction.
Thanks, Katie. All right, so what exactly have you all signed up for today? Our learning objectives, we're going to try to introduce or do a good refresh on the 5 primary utility cost tests that we see in our industry. We also want to try to make everyone feel a little more common or a little more comfortable with the common cost effectiveness terminology that we use. We also wanted to, we have a slide in here where we wanted to provide some insight on the tests that are most commonly used in the US, but also by what states and what jurisdictions to give a broader view of who's using these, how are they using these. We also are going to take a deep dive. We're going to start talking about what are the different costs and benefits that are considered in each test. And as mentioned, kind of try to tie it together at the end with a couple of working examples. So jumping right in, let's talk about, what is the purpose of a cost effectiveness test? I think, the simplest way to put it is this is just a measurement of whether our offerings are truly beneficial to the impacted stakeholders. Are the cost benefits that result from these offerings, do they completely offset any costs associated with these offerings? So I think many of us know a lot of the utility programs that we run today are funded by ratepayers. So we want to make sure that we're being good stewards of those ratepayer dollars and really driving some big benefits to all stakeholders in the process. A lot of us also know that cost effectiveness is a critical part of our energy efficiency program planning and reporting processes. We are often required to hit certain cost effectiveness marks, certain cost effectiveness tests, to even have the green light to move forward on these offerings. And the other thing we put in here kind of as a purpose for cost effectiveness tests, it's a great way for all of us that are looking at them to just kind of ask questions, poke at some of our design, say, does this make sense? Are there ways to make our programs more cost effective? Is it truly an effective offering overall to all of our clients? And what happens when we make these changes? What impacts happen to our rates? What happens to our participants? How do our costs from a utility increase or decrease as a result of these cost tests? So before we start talking about each of the cost tests, thought we'd kind of do a quick overview of what are we talking about when we're trying to figure out if something is cost effective. So you invited an engineer to a training, so I've got to kick off with at least one equation. And what we're talking about is what we refer to as the benefit cost ratio. And simply put, we want to know, does the net present value of the sum of all of the benefits in a unit of dollars exceed the net present value of the sum of all of the costs also in dollars? So simply put, do the benefits from a cost in a dollar amount offset the cost, the total cost of the program? And what that would look like is if your benefit cost ratio is greater than 1, that indicates that your offering is cost effective. If your test result equals 1, then it's that's the break-even point. And if you have a test result that's less than 1, it's an indicator that maybe your offering is not cost effective. And one thing I do want to hone in on a little bit, again, this is a 101, so we're going to keep it simple. But when we're talking about net present value here, I wanted to point it out just for a minute because when we're looking at the cost analysis here, we have to be thinking about the total life of the offering and the measures installed in those offerings. So, a simple example, if I'm installing a high efficiency HVAC system in my home, I'm going to see a lot of those costs at the beginning. I'm going to see the costs on the day that I install it. Utilities are going to see the costs associated with running the program in the year in which it occurs. Incentives are going to be paid in the year in which it's installed. However, many of the benefits are going to be recognized over the next 15 years or so that equipment functions in my home. So when we talk about net present value, what we're trying to say is we've got to capture all of the benefits and all of the costs over that total period of time in which that equipment is operating in my home. So moving on to introducing kind of the 5 stars of the show today, we're going to talk about what are the 5 most common cost benefit tests that we use in our industry. And so the 5 include the total resource cost test, the program administrator cost test or utility cost test, it's the same thing, the participant cost test, the ratepayer impact measure, or the societal cost test. And Katie's going to go into a deeper dive on each of these. What we want to point out here is each test is designed to look at a specific perspective, and it's also designed to answer a specific question. So the total resource cost test is looking at the perspective of, does the service territory as a whole benefit from this offering existing? And the question we're trying to answer is, will the total cost of energy in that service territory decrease as a result of this offering? And each of these 5 tests have different costs and different benefits that are looked at in order to determine whether they are cost effective. So on this next slide, I wanted to take a minute just to kind of introduce that terminology before we get into the details of each cost test. So here on the left, we have kind of categorized what are the different benefits and different costs we're going to be talking about. This is the whole pool of what will be included for all 5 tests today, but each test is only going to use a unique set of those of each of these inputs. So the first one I think we're all familiar with is just what is the avoided energy and demand impact. That's always going to be perceived as a benefit no matter what cost test you're looking at. Another input we look at is additional resource savings. This one is not used as commonly, but what we're talking about there is, for example, if you are a gas utility and you have a measure in one of your offerings that also generates electric and or water savings, in some jurisdictions, you can account for the benefit of those additional savings, even if you are a gas utility driving electric or water savings. Another one we're all familiar with that's always going to be perceived as a cost is program overhead. So what does it truly cost to create this offering? What does it cost to do marketing, outreach, implementation, evaluation? What are all the administrative costs required to create the offering for those end users? The next 2 are also probably things you're all familiar with, of just some additional costs from the utility perspective. Are there any increased costs for equipment or O&M related activities that need to occur in order to make these offerings, make the offerings real? And then also for the customers, what are the costs that they incur to participate in the program? So going back to my example, if I were to install a high efficient HVAC system in my home, maybe a baseline piece of equipment is $6,000 and I decide to install the higher efficient one that's $8,000. That $2,000 variance is a real cost that I, as the customer, am incurring. We have to account for when we're talking about cost effectiveness. The next 2 are where things get a little interesting. It's where a input might be perceived as a benefit or a cost. So customer bill savings. When we talk about the participant cost test here in a little bit, we'll go through these in more detail. But for a participant, bill savings is a great benefit, right? They're going to be paying less on their utility bills. This is really great for them. However, when you look at it from a ratepayer impact measure perspective, the customer bill savings are actually perceived as a cost because that's potentially lost revenue to the utility. Same with incentive payments. That can be both a benefit or a cost depending on which test you're looking at. But the incentive, from a participant perspective, is great. You're going to receive a higher incentive to participate in the program. However, from a utility perspective, that's also a cost that's incurred to run the program. And then the last 2 are probably the 2 we see least commonly in a lot of the cost effectiveness tests we're running now, but they're starting to pop up more and more with activities going on across the US these days. But in some cases, if there is a tax credit available for certain measures, you can count that as a benefit in your cost effectiveness analysis. And also, are there any environmental or non-energy benefits that your programs are creating? We always tend to focus on the energy efficiency pieces, but there's a lot of other really great benefits to these programs. They're a lot harder to quantify. How do you quantify health improvements, or how do you quantify what an emissions reduction might look like? How do you quantify comfort? So there has been some progress in this space, and there are utilities that have include this now and have been for a while. There are some that are starting to include it and some that are exploring those now going forward. So before I hand it over to Katie to do a deep dive on each of the 5 cost tests to get the details of what goes into each one, I did want to just share a quick map of, I guess, a quick table of the 5 participant cost tests and where they are currently required and where they're being used across the US. So you'll see on the right side, it just indicates which states are looking at which tests. Those that are in bold is the designated kind of primary test that the utility will focus on in order to, I will not offer my program unless this cost test is met. So what we want to point out here initially is, if you notice, the 2 most common are going to be the utility cost test and the total resource cost test. They've got almost 3 rows of states there that are looking at those. And if you look at the kind of the bold indicators, you'll see that the total resource cost test is probably the most common primary test that states are using to determine cost effectiveness. So for example, I sit in Austin, Texas. Texas right now only uses the utility cost test as their primary cost effectiveness test. But if you were to look at Colorado, for example, they do use the total resource cost test as their primary, but they actually do screen and look at the other 4 cost tests as well. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Katie, and she's going to talk us through each of the 5 cost tests. What's the perspective? What's the question we're trying to answer? And what are the benefits and costs? And I'll come back to meet you here in a little bit to go through some examples. So Katie, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, so we're going to jump in and do a little bit more of a deep dive now. So starting with the total resource cost test. Like Rebecca said, this is going to be probably our most common test. It's the most common test we're going to see across the United States used. And that's for a number of reasons that we'll get into in just a second. But what's the question we're trying to answer with this test? We're looking at, will the total cost of energy in the utility service territory decrease as a result of the energy efficiency programs? And now we're just going to look at what are the benefits and what are the costs of this test. So starting with our benefits, our one main benefit for just the base TRC are going to be our avoided energy and demand costs. So this is going to be the costs that were saved associated with the reduction in transmission, distribution, generation, and capacity related costs. And then you'll see down below, we've got a few additional benefits. These benefits are actually going to be associated with a modified TRC, which kind of serves as an intermediate. You can think of it as an intermediary between the traditional TRC and kind of our societal cost test that we'll talk a little bit more about in a little bit. But this is where you can kind of account for additional benefits. So a few of those are like your additional resource savings. So if you're a gas utility, you can maybe claim some electric savings. If you're an electric utility, you might be able to claim some gas savings. And then also maybe you can claim some water savings. Maybe you're doing a steam trap measure and there's additional water savings that you can claim to kind of bump up those benefits a little bit. Also, some environmental or non-energy benefits to society. So maybe you're quantifying a value of greenhouse gas emission reduction. Maybe you're putting a value to that. Maybe you're valuing public health. And this also, what we see with the modified TRC across the United States is it doesn't necessarily need to have a hard value on it. A lot of different jurisdictions are kind of adding maybe a kicker or an adder of maybe like 5% or 10% just to really acknowledge those benefits, but maybe not going through the whole maybe complex process of actually putting a monetary value on those things. And then also sometimes you'll see applicable tax credits being counted into this benefit cost ratio. I will say that's not as common, but we do see it sometimes. Now looking at the costs for the TRC are going to be your program overhead. So that's going to be your marketing, your admin, your evaluation, those types of things. And then also your equipment installation and operations and maintenance costs, both from a utility and a customer perspective. So those are the things that we're trying to consider when we do our benefit cost ratio here. And as you can see, the more benefits you can associate with the benefit side, so whether that be adding these environmental benefits or things like that, you can really help boost your TRC a little bit. So now we're going to look at what are the strengths and weaknesses of our TRC. So one of the strengths is really that the TRC evaluates at a system-wide level. So it really gives you a good comprehensive or holistic view at all the different parties involved. And that's probably why it's the most popular, right? You're getting a really great view of the whole picture rather than a more singular perspective. Also, another strength is incentives are neutral in this test, so they're not counted as a benefit or a cost. So that means it really adds a lot of flexibility for your program design or your portfolio design. You can play around with incentive levels as much as you want, and it's not going to have an impact on your TRC score. One weakness, though, with the TRC, we will say, it is sensitive to differences between long-term projection of marginal costs and rates. So a lot of the times when we're looking at our avoided costs, we're looking over an extended period of time, right? So we're looking, maybe 20 or 30 years, and it can be really difficult to quantify with certainty when we're forecasting that far out. So that's something to consider that can impact your TRC score over time. And then what are our most impactful inputs that we see? This can be your equipment and labor costs, right? This is something that's very sensitive to market fluctuations, and we're seeing that right now with inflation. Labor costs are increasing, equipment costs are increasing. These things can have a big impact on TRC scores, especially when it's a very equipment heavy program. So that's something to keep in mind. And also our avoided costs. If you're not including some of those other environmental or non-energy benefits that can help boost you up, that's really going to be your main benefit. So it's really important to consider your methodology when you're looking at your avoided energy and demand costs. Are you only looking at avoided costs in terms of transmission and distribution, or are you also looking at operation and maintenance? Are you maybe looking at ancillary services? Are you really including everything that goes in to that, providing that energy and providing the supply? And then also our savings assumptions. So this is really where we rely on our engineering team, right, to make sure that our savings assumptions are solid so we can really account for all the associated savings and all the associated benefits for our individual measures. Now we're going to move on to the Program Administrator Cost Test, or PACT, or the Utility Cost Test, UCT. See, sometimes you can hear those, use those interchangeably depending on where you are in the country. And the question we're really trying to answer here is, will utility bills or cost to the utility increase as a result of these programs? So this one, we're really looking from the utility perspective. So going into our benefits and costs, our benefits for this test, again, are avoided energy and demand costs, or a reduction in transmission, distribution, generation, those capacity related costs. And then our costs are going to be program overhead, again, our admin, marketing, evaluation, and then also incentives paid to the customer. So incentives do play into this benefit cost ratio as opposed to the TRC. So now we're going to look at our strengths and our weaknesses. One of our strengths is that measures with high incremental costs or new technologies can still pass in this test because we're not looking at those equipment costs. So that's a huge benefit if you want to try out, maybe you want to play around with your measure mix, maybe you want to try a newer technology that has a high price tag because it's a newer technology. That's something that you'll have the flexibility to do if you're screening with the UCT. Also, one strength is it's a more simplified methodology because it is just looking from the utility perspective. But you'll notice we do have this in the weakness column as well, because that can be a weakness as well, right? You're just looking from one perspective. It kind of leaves out the other parts of the mix or the other stakeholders involved, so it might not be sufficiently comprehensive, and it's excluding those costs endured by the customer. Our most impactful inputs for the UCT or PACT are going to be our incentive amounts, like we said. So this one you might need to be a little more cautious about your incentive amounts, or just put a little more thought into what those levels are as proportioned with the cost of the equipment. Also, our avoided costs again, so we're looking at our energy and demand costs, making sure that that methodology, you're covering as many of your bases as you can. You're really looking at all of your avoided costs from running these programs, and also your program overhead. So this is where you can kind of also get creative with design. Maybe you can find more efficiencies, or maybe you can look at some low touch program design. If there's one part of your program or one part of your portfolio that requires a more high touch, maybe there's another area where you can find additional efficiencies to kind of keep that program overhead piece in check. All right. Next, we're going to look at the participant cost test. So this one is another singular view test. So we're looking at just the participant here. And the question we're answering is, will the participant realize a net benefit over the life of the measure? So we're going to go and look at our benefits and costs. So our benefits for this one are customer bill savings. Obviously, that's a big benefit to the customer, the participant, the incentive payments, and any applicable tax credits. And our costs are going to be those incremental equipment and installation costs, and the incremental operation and maintenance costs that the customer would have to endure. Next, we're going to look at our strengths and weaknesses. So a strength of this test is it's a really good mechanism for determining customer satisfaction, because we're just looking from the participant or the customer perspective. We can really get a good idea of all of the associated benefits for the customer. So this can indicate potential participation rates if you're trying to see how attractive a program would be to your customers, and potentially provide some information for designing appropriate incentive levels. One weakness though, it isn't, obviously we said it's narrowly focused, right? So it's narrowly focused, it just looks at the participant and the associated benefits and costs to them. But also it's narrowly focused in that we can only use quantifiable variables, right? We're using an equation for this. So, but that's not the whole picture when we're thinking about the customer decision-making process. There might be some other things that would lead them to ultimately make that decision to install a certain measure. So whether that be they're looking for increased comfort level, we can't really quantify that, right? That's difficult. Or maybe they're wanting to reduce draftiness, or maybe they just are doing it for aesthetic purposes. There are some other, types of things that go into that decision-making process. So it doesn't necessarily capture all the complexities or measure all of the benefits and costs. The most impactful input for this one is again going to be our equipment and labor costs. We said these fluctuate a lot due to the market, due to inflation and things like that, and these can have a big impact on the participant cost test. So next, we're going to move on to the ratepayer impact measure test. So this test looks at, will non-participants benefit from the associated program? So this is going to be all ratepayers, not just the ratepayers that are participating in the program. So now we're going to look at our benefits and costs. So we only have one benefit for the ratepayer impact measure test, and that's going to be our avoided costs. So again, those reductions in transmission, distribution, generation, capacity related costs. Our costs are going to be program overhead, incentives, equipment and installation costs, and customer bill savings. So you can obviously see this one has, we've only got one benefit associated here, and we're very cost heavy. So you'll see a little bit more on the next slide, but kind of spoiler, this one is very difficult to pass for that reason, because we've got a lot more costs accounted for than our benefits. A strength of this program, though, it does apply well to load management programs. I will caveat by saying that's if you have the infrastructure already installed, if the infrastructure is already there, maybe for a demand response program, and the only associated costs would be to actually call the event, then this is something that can work well for that, and it might be able to pass. But other than that, it's very difficult for non-DR programs to pass, and DR programs as well that don't have the infrastructure already in place. Another strength, though, it is useful for comparing impacts among options. So this is why sometimes you'll see the RIMS test still screen for it. Maybe it's not the primary test, but they still screen for it because it gives a good idea of what's happening across the ratepayers in a service territory. So it gives you kind of that alternate perspective. Our weaknesses here, it is sensitive again to those differences between the long-term projection of marginal costs of rates. Again, we're projecting so far out, it's just difficult to quantify with certainty what those true values are going to be. And then also, like we said, it's very narrowly focused and very difficult to pass. Our most impactful input here is going to be those avoided costs. That's our only benefit that we get to account for with the RIM test. So it's really important, like we said, that your methodology is really solid. It's really comprehensive. You're really including all of the associated costs in that calculation. And the last test we're going to look at is the societal cost test, or the SCT. So with this one, we're looking, is all of society better off? Are we better off as a whole as a result of these programs? So our benefits for the societal cost test, we're looking at avoided energy and demand. Again, we're looking at those additional resource savings. So like I said, for the TRC, this could be, if you're a gas utility, it could be electric savings. Electric utility could be gas savings, could be those water savings, applicable tax credits. We do have a note here, it is excluded by some utilities. We don't see that as much, but it does happen in some cases. And then also our environmental and non-energy benefits. So this is where the societal cost test can really be extremely comprehensive depending on what you want to include. So what do you want to put a value on? Do you want to put a value on public health? Do you want to put a value on emissions reductions? Do you want to put a value on maybe increased comfort level? There are a lot of different pieces that you can try to quantify or put an adder on, like we said, maybe a 5%, 10%, 15% in some cases, to kind of account for those additional benefits. And then our costs here are going to be that program overhead, utility equipment installation and operations and maintenance costs, and then the customer incremental equipment installation and operations and maintenance costs. So here with our strength, we're looking, it's useful for jurisdictions that are seeking to implement or comply with GHG reduction targets. So if you're in a city or a state maybe that has specific reductions targets, this can be a useful tool for compliance purposes. Also, it can be used to evaluate water savings, health impacts, air quality, all these different pieces that kind of go into when we're really looking at how is society benefiting as a whole. There are a lot of different pieces that we can kind of pull in. A weakness, factors included might be beyond a utility commission's jurisdiction. So this might, a few of these pieces might be something that you need the state legislature to get involved with to kind of quantify or do maybe some studies on, things like that. Also, associated values can be very difficult to quantify. It can be very difficult to put a value on, health. It can be very difficult to put a value on comfort or, air quality and things like that. So this can be a little bit more difficult to quantify, and also can be a little bit more time consuming in terms of the length of time that it takes to get to the decision of what that value is actually going to be. The most impactful input here is going to be those additional benefits, so those environmental and non-energy benefits to society. So the more that you can kind of account for or attribute to the programs, the more benefits that you're going to see in your benefit cost ratio. Now we're going to get this gives us a good visual of all of the costs and benefits that we've talked about so far, and how those lay over our 5 tests, right? So you'll see like avoided costs. Those are going to be a benefit in 4 of our 5 tests. They're always going to be a benefit no matter what. But then if you look down at maybe incentive payments, you'll see that it's a cost in the UCT or PACT test and in the RIM test, but it's a benefit in the PCT. So it just kind of depends on the perspective that we're looking from, that these things can vary. But this is a good cheat sheet if you just want to get a good idea and remember maybe, hey, do incentives value into my TRC? And I can look down there and see that no, they don't. So it's a good high level overview to just have as a little cheat sheet. But I'll pass this back over to Rebecca for our next portion.
Great, thanks, Katie. So now we tried to come up with a good kind of hypothetical, by hypothetical I mean completely made up program, and kind of run it through some of these tests and apply some numbers to it, and see how how would we calculate it, what if we change some of those numbers. So for our example today, here is kind of the setup for it. We're going to go through and say we're going to design a really simple program that we're going to try to install 100 smart thermostats. And if we were to go down and look through what are the benefits and costs we're going to assign to this, again, you see the caveat at the bottom. Engineers, we love caveats. This example is intentionally arbitrary, so this is not reflective of any real analysis that we have done, just for kind of those demonstrative purposes today. So we're going to say that our program, when we looked at it, is going to have about $35,000 in avoided energy and demand costs for the lifetime of the thermostats that are installed. We're going to assume we're in a jurisdiction we're not allowed to include any additional resource savings, even though this isn't a piece of equipment that could have potentially both gas and electric savings. We're going to assume a $15,000 cost for program admin. So that's just the cost to create this offering for the end users over the course of a year, let's say. And great news if you're the utility, there's no added cost for this offering. You don't have to install any equipment, no added cost to O&M in order to create this offering for your customers. The customer is going to see a cost, we assumed, of $135 per unit to install it. So that comes up with $13,500 to install 100 thermostats. The customer is going to receive about $250 in net present value savings over the course of the life of the equipment installed. So it's a $25,000 customer bill savings that we're going to assume. And we're going to give the utilities going to be really generous. We're going to give $110 per unit installed, so a total incentives bucket of $11,000. These units don't have any tax credits available in this hypothetical situation, but just for fun, we did say, hey, what if we do have some regulatory sign off on including some non-energy benefits for emissions reductions through these thermostats, and we gave it a $7,500 value. So this is our setup. This is what we're going to go through in a couple of examples. But first, again, those caveats. One thing I did want to touch on is just indicating here that we are taking a pretty simplified approach for today. We're doing simple payback calculation, but there are a lot of other cost effectiveness terms you might have heard. And Katie and I would love to come back and do a 102 session and dig in on some of the other inputs that are kind of going on in the background of some of the assumptions that we made here. So you might hear about, how do you include net to gross ratios? How does that impact cost effectiveness? Because they do if you're in an evaluated market. How are you always accounting for all of your measure lives, especially if you have a portfolio with multiple measures with various measure lives across it, and other economic inputs that we kind of didn't dig in on today, but would love to do a follow-up or available to dig in on more after the call today. But how are you incorporating, what discount rates are you using and why, and which rates do you use depending on which test you're looking at? Are you accounting for leakage and loss rates? How are you thinking about levelized avoided costs? How are you projecting customer bill rates? So there's a lot of other details that we're not digging in on today, but wanted to make sure we shared that we're aware of that, and would be a great topic for a follow-up. But for today, we're going to keep it simple. We're going to do simple payback, and we're going to start with our example that we just painted and look at the TRC and the UCT first, because we know those are the most commonly referenced cost tests. So for our example smart thermostat program that we're going to run, what we're talking about in terms of cost from the TRC perspective is the measure cost. So the cost to install that $135 thermostat, and then the program overhead of $15,000. So the total cost in this example would be $28,500 to create this offering. However, the benefits are $35,000. We're saying, by installing all of these thermostats, we're going to recognize $35,000 in avoided energy and demand costs. So when you look at, to get to this benefit cost ratio, it's just simply that 35,000 divided by 28,500, which gives us a benefit cost ratio of 1.23 in this example, which would indicate, it's above 1. So that's a good indicator that this is a cost-effective opportunity for you to consider in your portfolio. If we jump over now and look at it from the perspective of the utility cost test, the cost that we associate for this example would be, again, that program overhead cost. So it's $15,000 to run the program. And as the utility, this is the utility perspective, you're going to pay out $11,000 incentive. So our total cost is $26,000. And again, we're only comparing that to the only benefit on this side is the avoided energy and demand costs. So in this case, again, we see that 35,000 divided by 26,000 would give us a benefit cost ratio of 1.35. So again, great, 2 out of 2 so far for our 2 cost tests to see whether or not we're cost effective. Now, let's say we want to look at it across, all 5. So we already looked at the TRC, we already looked at the UCT, but for the participant cost test, what does that look like? So we see that, the participant, the only cost we're really looking at there is the cost to actually install the equipment. So that $13,500 reflects what it would cost to install 100 smart thermostats. But the benefits are pretty great, because the benefit, again, is the perspective of the participant. So the participant's going to get $110 for participating in the program. So that's where you get that $11,000 in total incentives that are paid out. And over time, each customer might see, about $250 in bill savings. So in this case, our benefits are substantially more than the cost. So for your participant, this is a great cost-effective opportunity for them to participate in. Gives you a nice, healthy benefit cost ratio of 2.67. However, when we jump over and look at it from the perspective of the ratepayer impact measure, this is the one Katie spoke to, where we're incorporating almost all the costs, but only looking at really one benefit of the offering. So in this case, we've got the program overhead again, we've got the incentive, because that's a cost incurred by the utility to offer the program. And this is where we see that bill rate is, or the bill savings actually converts to doesn't cover, it's just perceived, it's the perspective is that it's seen as, it's lost revenue to the utility. So it's captured as a cost in this test. So in this case, with our only benefit being the avoided energy and demand cost, we're going to see that we drop below 1 here. So our RIM test is coming in below 1, indicating that from the perspective of the RIM test, this potentially is not going to be a cost-effective offering if that is the main screening test that you're using to determine whether or not to move forward with an offering. And lastly, though, if we move over to the societal cost test, the cost here again is just the cost of the equipment, so that cost of that $135 for each install and the program cost. And then our benefits are again the total avoided energy and demand costs. And then that just for fun plug we made to say, hey, we're going to monetize some emissions impacts for this program. And so in this case, we see that we have another passing score of 1.49. So when you look at this rolled up for this hypothetical example we've created, we've got 4 out of 5 of these cost effectiveness tests that are passing. And typically when we see something like this in the teams that we work with, this would be an opportunity, this would be a really good program to consider moving forward with and rolling out. Or if you're doing this on the flip side, being able to confirm, okay, great, we're cost effective. Maybe you only use the TRC or the UCT, so you made it through the first hurdle of complying with regulatory requirements. But it's also, looking at these other perspective, it's also really cost effective to your participants and to society. So let's say though you're looking at this and you're thinking, I really want to get these 100 thermostats out in the market as quickly as possible. What if I want to change my design a little bit and I want to increase my incentive dollars to the participants to get these moving faster? So let's take the same scenario and change it to increase the incentive that's paid out to the participants in the program. So if we do that, we see that out of the 5 tests, only 3 of them are going to be impacted by changing the incentive. So if you're using a utility cost test, you've got to take into consideration that in changing your incentive, whether you change it up or down, in this case, we're increasing it. So it's going to have an increase in cost, which potentially is going to have a negative impact on our cost effectiveness test. And same with the RIM test, it's going to be included as an increase in this situation. We're increasing costs. So you'll see for both of these, the UCT, our original benefit cost ratio is 1.35, but to increase that incentive, we're going to see our score drop a little bit to 1.27. But you know what? It's still showing that it's cost effective. And if it's really important in this case to increase those incentives to drive participation, no harm done from the perspective here. It's a little less cost effective, but it still beats the score it needs to. The RIM test, you also see a slight decline there. This one was already in the red. It's going to stay in the red with that increased cost. But when you're thinking about it from the perspective of the participant, the incentive payment is considered a benefit. So that's going to increase the benefit cost ratio here because there's an increase on the benefit side of the equation. So you'll see that one move from 2.67 to 2.78. So again, making that change, if that was something important to you, was to really to drive more participation through increased incentives. In this situation, we're seeing, we still have 4 out of 5 of the cost tests passing. So let's say you wanted to consider another design change in your program, and you're thinking, I really want to leverage this opportunity to do a lot of heavy touch with my customers. And to do that, I'm going to have to increase my program admin. I've got to do more marketing and I've got to do more outreach. But to do that, I've got to double my program overhead costs. So when you do that, you'll see that the program overhead costs is a factor in the TRC, the UCT, the RIM test, and the societal cost test. And across the board, when we double that program overhead cost, it's going to have a negative impact on all of our benefit cost ratios for those 4 cost tests. And what we'll see is, as much as we might love to use this opportunity as a really great outreach to our customers, it's going to push our cost effectiveness below that 1.0 cutoff. And maybe now it's starting to look like it, under that design, maybe it's not as great of a cost effective opportunity to offer to your customers. So let's take another quick scenario and say we just got some updated avoided cost data with some new projections, and it looks like we're going to see an increase in our avoided costs, our avoided energy and demand costs over time. So what happens here is, our avoided cost is a benefit across the board in the TRC, the UCT, the RIM, and the societal cost test. And if we increase our benefit across all 4 of these, we will also see that our updated cost ratios down here at the bottom also increase. Room test still isn't passing, but we're seeing that each of these offerings are more cost effective with that change to our avoided cost ratio. So to kind of what Katie spoke to earlier is just really making sure if you're involved in setting those avoided cost rates, make sure you've got everything included in there, because that has a big influence on how your cost effectiveness plays out. And so our last scenario, just to kind of walk through one last example, something we're all seeing. What happens if, I learn that within this program, my projected measure costs are increasing. We've got inflation, we've got supply and demand issues, and I underestimated what it would actually cost to install these units, and actually my measure cost is going to increase by 50%. So in this scenario where we see a measure cost to the customer, in this case, increase, that's going to impact your TRC, your participant cost test, and your societal cost test. In this case, again, we're increasing the cost side across all 3, which is actually going to drive your cost effectiveness ratios down. So what we see here is, our TRC has now dropped below 1, but our participant cost test and our societal cost test are still above 1, so they're still cost effective. But this one might be a harder decision to make, because if you're governed by a TRC requirement for cost effectiveness, you no longer are showing a passing score here. So you'd have to think through, are there different ways to adjust the program design to kind of make up for that cost effectiveness due to this change in the measure cost. So that was the last example. Hopefully it was helpful. I know there's a lot of numbers on a page, but just to kind of see what are the different tests, what are the different benefits, put some numbers around it, move some things around, and see how you can influence, your cost effectiveness with design changes within your program. So we're going to kind of wrap up and talk about some things to ponder. So at this time, if you have a question, you can raise your hand or type them into the chat, and we're going to get to those here in just a minute. Wanted to just revisit my learning objectives. Hopefully you had a good introduction or refresher on the 5 utility cost tests that we went over. Hopefully in the last 20 minutes or so of conversation, you've gained some really good insight on the terminology. You also got some insight on how those cost tests are used. Maybe you're only using one where you sit now. Is there any value for you to be thinking about how these other tests come into play, what they tell you about your program that might be of value to share? Hopefully working through these examples at the end gave you some good insight too of which costs and which benefits go into each test, and what happens when they change or move or shift, or how can we look at these when we're thinking about program design changes. So while we're waiting, I haven't seen any hands pop up yet or questions in the chat, but we'll put some things out to ponder and see if maybe it draws some questions. Oop, I did see a question in there. But things to think about, and then we'll jump in on that one question that came in. What trends are you seeing in your service territories right now? We're seeing baselines that are shifting and in a lot of cases decreasing savings for measures we've seen in our programs for a long time. We're seeing these incremental costs increasing due to market changes we're all experiencing. We're seeing, those avoided costs, we're seeing them increase and decrease depending on where you are in the US. The other question we have is, how are you looking at the non-energy benefits for your program? So those harder to quantify things in terms of, as Katie mentioned, comfort, sound reduction, noise reduction, emissions, health improvements. How are we quantifying those? And in my opinion, that's a really major benefit to these programs. And if we're not including them in some way in your programs, is that a really good opportunity for you to be engaging with your regulatory leaders to say, these are real benefits to end users, to society, and to our communities. How do we capture these better? And again, we kind of hit on this, but if you're only looking at maybe 1 or 2 cost tests, maybe looking at these other ones will help you gain some insight on other aspects of the performance of your programs, even if they're not required. And the other thing we didn't talk about today was just how are you analyzing your program? And the example we went through today, we kind of did it was a small program, 100 units we're trying to install. But if you're analyzing cost effectiveness at the measure level, that might be really restricting. We're going to need to start seeing new measures coming into our programs, well always, but especially right now as some big baseline shifts we've been seeing recently. And maybe some of those measures initially are going to be a bit more costly, and maybe they're not cost effective right out of the gate, but they will be in time. And so if you're doing your cost effectiveness analysis, the measure level, that might exclude that measure from being included in your portfolio right now. But if you're looking at the program or the portfolio level, you can leverage other high performing, more cost effective measures to kind of offset that. So something to be thinking about. And then other things I think we could have 2-hour sessions on all by themselves, things that we're thinking and pondering, I know you all are too, is just how will some of these RIA funds impact cost effectiveness? How are they going to be incorporated? How are we going to think about them when we're looking at cost effectiveness? And also, again, to the part we glossed over today, maybe the 102 session, if there's interest, is just how do we dig in on discount factors? How do we dig in on how evaluation rates impact these? What about how we're projecting changes in customer rates over the next 10, 20, 30 years? So all things for further exploration that come up when we're talking about these.